Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the first episode of the Content Intelligence series, a new BrightTALK series where we'll be exploring the process to create high-performing, engaging content that from a data-driven perspective. My name is Nick Markwith, and I've been in BrightTALK for about 9 years, working with our clients to help produce hundreds of virtual events, webinar series, and online presentations to help better resonate with their audience and help drive conversions. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone that today is live interactive, so please ask questions to the player at the bottom, as well as provide us feedback and ratings. We want to hear from you. We want to improve the series as well, so please provide us feedback, and we'll be happy to incorporate that and give you exactly what you're looking for from today. As we get started, I want to talk about a little bit about how we're going to go into today's presentation. And so today, we'll be digging into a few different things before we get into the content creation process itself. First off, so we'll be looking into how your content strategy really depends on your understanding of your audience as well as their buying habits. The way that people buy nowadays has changed. It's no longer straightforward. It's no longer talk to a salesperson, get the sale. And so we're going to be talking about how that new buying process is impacting your content strategy and how you can influence their decision through that content. In an effort to be open and honest, we are going to be looking at very heavily on the B2B buyer. So while many of these strategies can be applied to B2C, want to make sure you're all aware before you get into a 30-minute presentation. That being said, we'll be in today's episode, we're going looking into the buying process, understanding how the audience buys from B2B vendors and big technology purchases, or even smaller ones. We'll be then looking at how you can build trust through content and what are the elements you need to hit in order to make sure that you are building that trust and providing value to your audience. And then we'll talk about how we turn those insights and the buying process into an actual strategy. And I'll end the presentation with a few additional tips on the best ways to drive authentic connection through your content by being open and honest. And so without further ado, let's get started. Today's buying journey is incredibly more complicated than ever before. Today's buying journey is really a web of digital experiences, and where you have to provide opportunities for your buyers to self-guide and do so in a way that's consistent and constantly telling your story versus showing. You need to do so across formats, across actual directions, whether it's webinars, ebooks, infographics, whether it's interviews, panels, or demos. But you need to be able to start reaching your audience where they are and how they are currently buying. And so, because the ease of access of information has really changed what the buying journey is nowadays. It's no longer, I think oftentimes about, when you used to buy a car. And how that has kind of changed from before to now. When you were used to buy a car, you would go and maybe do a little bit of research, have some idea of what you're looking for, some of the requirements, but really you're going to the dealership to understand more about brands, more about the specifics of the model, as well as learn from the salesperson in order to do so. This dynamic, going to the salesperson to learn, has changed drastically. And so, in order for you to be reaching that audience, you have to reach them where they're coming, because they're already going and doing the research before they ever get to you. And so, serious decisions. I love this quote because it's true. 67% of the buyer's journey is now done digitally. So you need to reach and meet your audience halfway. And you need to ensure that you're providing the content so that they can make their own decisions and that you reach them at the time in which they're evaluating whatever products, services, or solutions that you may have. And so, but this isn't linear, and it's truly not possible to try and map the entire journey out, because look at this. On the right, you'll see on the right side, Gartner started outlining, I really enjoyed this report. I highly recommend you go and check this out. But Gartner really recently talked about the new buying journey and the new buying process. And so from whether it's problem identification to solution exploration to requirements building, or even supplier selection, there are lots of opportunity for you to influence your audience to buy your product. But even looking at this gives me anxiety. This is a lot to cover, and you can't map out everything. And so what we'll be talking about a little bit about today, but really with them throughout the series, is how do you really reach this audience when the buyer's journey is so complex and that you can't map out all of the different steps that are required, because the way that one buyer researches is going to be different, whether based off who they are, where they're located, their background, the industry, everything along those lines. And so you need to be able to reach your buyer where they are and guide them through the process by giving more than asking. And there isn't just one path to be driving the buyer's journey. There are multiple paths, as you see here. And so you need to make sure that with your content, because your content is really the first stop and really the first way in which your audience is going to interact with you, you need to make sure your content is giving value and covering as much of this as possible, but allowing them to self-guide and just knowing your audience. And so what we'll be talking about a little bit later today is understanding your audience better and what that means. Because ultimately, the buyer's journey is no longer directed by the marketer. It's self-directed, and self-service matters, especially to B2B. When I look at when I talk to different clients and we discuss how to best create content that resonates with our audience, they are looking for ways to really just convert audiences as quickly as possible. But this is a journey, and this is a relationship that you're building, and it takes time. And so as you are trying to create content that resonates with your audience, you need to think about that, self-service and self-guidance matters, and you need to be ready for it. McKinsey and Company recently produced a report, believe in June, that looked at how COVID-19 has been impacting businesses and budgets. There's three main themes that came out of it. First and foremost, spend. Not surprisingly, a lot of companies with the potential of possibly a recession are generally reducing spend to manage their risk. But there is a sizable number of companies that are actually increasing and investing heavily into digital and creating that digital experience, because whoever can convert and change fastest is going to help create and generate mindshare and build up brand awareness. Digital, so I think this one is most relevant for us, but B2B digital interactions are going to be 2 to 3 times more important to customers than traditional sales interactions. So the way in which I've read a bunch of research that shows what are the factors and why people purchase different products and solutions. Features and pricing tend to be the top 2, but the third, not surprisingly, is the purchasing experience. How they got from identifying their idea and how you helped them and supported them throughout the experience to eventually them deciding on you is a big, massive part of the buying process nowadays. And so you need to really be thinking about the digital experience and giving ways in which your audience can self-direct and continue to research on their own. And then finally, not surprisingly, remote. Almost 90% of sales have moved to video conferencing or phone. And it's unlikely that this is going to go away since it's been so effective. There are lots of reasons why you need to be creating content that not only looks at the buyer's journey, but helps them guide through the process. But the other part, and just to add just a little bit more complexity, is that the buying group isn't just one person. It actually involves about 6 to 10 different decision makers, and most of their time isn't spent talking to you. Most of their time is actually spent researching, determining requirements, researching independently. There is a lot in which you need to be able to influence their decisions and their thoughts without ever talking to a potential buyer. And so the way in order to do that really is through content. And so it's not surprising that Gartner, B2B buyers are looking for there are many people involved in this buying, whether it is more junior level individuals doing the research, looking for different solutions, presenting that to managers and directors, to the final decision maker, and all the other people involved in that process. If it's a technology purchase, there's going to be a finance person involved, an IT or technology engineering person involved. There are many people influencing the decision on what's going to be created. And that means you need to create content that targets those personas and that buying committee. Whether you're doing an ABM approach or whether you're doing an approach that is less targeted, you need to be influencing all the buying committee and looking to influence their decisions as they're researching, not when they're talking to you. Because by the time they're coming to you to talk to you and asking for meetings, asking for demos, things along those lines, they've already made some decisions, and hopefully their content will resonate. Will resonate and attract them. And then finally, but how do you do that? So there's a perceived trust gap in B2B sales that needs to be addressed. People know that when a salesperson reaches out, they're obviously trying to sell to them, but your content shouldn't be always selling so directly. Your content needs to be resonating, be supported, be helpful. And so next what we'll be talking about is how do you create that content that builds that trust and allows you to really meet your buyers on their terms. And so that's the buying process has changed, and so you have to adjust and meet them your buyers where they are. And so what we'll be talking about next is how does content really influence that role. Buyers are looking for content that really speaks to their needs and issues. That's not anything new. Looking at how your solutions solve pain points isn't surprising, and that's not a novel idea. But I think what really came out to me with some of this research was the importance of content during this process. Whether it's them going to your website, whether it is very specific, feature content, or it's thought leadership content, all of this plays a role that influences your buyers. But you need to make sure that the content you're creating reaches formats and is accessible, because that's what they're expecting now, and you need to meet your audience's expectations. And so part of what this means is, so content really offers that touch point. It allows you to reach a buyer before a human ever speaks, and it just plays such a crucial role because 70% of that purchasing process is done without ever talking to you. And so what we'll be going over next is how do you create that trust? How do you fill that gap so that you can reach your audience and start building that relationship, so whether they are ready to buy or not, they think of you first as a solution and to solve their pain points and needs. So how do you build trust with content? I from some of my experience with working with lots of Fortune 500 clients, producing our own content for our audience, there's been a few different steps I found to be overly effective when reaching our audience, and really start creating that feeling of trust and building upon that relationship. First and foremost, not surprisingly, will be to be open and honest. I think this is a little bit obvious, but a lot of, I think when you are open and honest through your content, and I think what that means for me is of course you're telling the truth, you're owning who you are, what you're up to, but you also own mistakes, you own whether failures, right? And you also are you're giving honesty in terms of what your content is actually going to do. So, oftentimes, I think one of the most common formats I see from some clients is a client using an analyst in conjunction with one of their product marketing or more marketing people on the presentation. Ultimately, and positioning it as a thought leadership piece of content, which, it is. You have an analyst on there that's giving you a lot of really great insights from their research. But oftentimes throughout this content, I find that a lot of clients will then switch to basically very similar to a demo. I find that's a bit, sometimes can be a bit bait and switch. Position your content as very thought leadership, very research based, but halfway through presenting it as a demo. Now, the way you present this can be through a title, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But also the abstract. So being open and honest means in the abstract explaining what's going to be happening in your presentation, in your content, so that you've set an expectation, so that you're not wasting people's time. I think that's the big thing, is you don't want people to join and view something only to find out it's something else. And that's an easy way to break that trust. Be transparent. I think one thing that I actually often recommend to our audience or to our clients is that people want to know what you're doing and what's working. How are you going and producing results? What's working for you, and giving an insider's look at what's happening. Because people buy from other people, they don't necessarily buy from companies. And so part of what you're trying to do is humanize and make it personable. And part of that is showing what's happening within your company. Something that we do, and we're doing more at BrightTALK, is talking about our content creation process, like today. And how does that process work from our perspective, and how do we go about doing it and helping teaching you guys? There's a lot of opportunity for you guys to be authentic and be transparent. And then, like I said, you want to be authentic. That means be real, be personable, be human, and be relatable. You don't want to position your content, like I said, you don't want to position your content as thought leadership that's secretly wrapped in a demo. You want to, like I said, own your mistakes and feel real to a company, because people like companies with personalities. People like companies that are giving and feel that they have some humans behind your website. And that part is really important, whether it's through your content, through the types of content you pick, or through social. Be unique and original. Now, part of this doesn't mean, I don't think you necessarily need to be coming up with new ideas that hasn't been done before. But I think you have a very specific perspective as your company that you should share. And so whether that means you giving a new angle, a new perspective around a certain topic that is important to your audience, or whether you're using your own data or research, like BrightTALK does, to produce content, it's really important that you show that you can be unique and original and stand out from the market. There's a lot of digital noise out there, especially right now, and it's important for you to stand out. And by providing something exclusive and unique, you're able to stand out in that way, and also build trust because you're giving that value. And then finally, the last thing I think probably is the most important, which we've covered a lot more, is be helpful and accessible. Your content needs to give value first before you start asking for more information, and you need to meet them more than they meet you. It's not realistic to ask for your leads to be giving you all information about whether they're ready to buy from the first touch point that you meet them. This is a relationship. You need to start slow. And so, the way that I found to be very, very effective is to give value. Help and teach your audience on trends, on problems, ways to avoid things, and just give. Because people who give tend to be the ones that stick out in people's minds. For example, I think one of my favorite marketing resources tends to be HubSpot. They have a lot of really great content that is very helpful, that's very practical, and helps solve some pain points that a lot of marketers have. They've also started structuring their content in a really interesting way. I highly recommend you check out, as an example, HubSpot. I think they do a really good job. But because they do it by giving you value, giving you templates, giving you ways in which you can gauge how well you're doing, as well as ensure that you are creating content, as well as resonating with them to solve their pain points. There's a lot of value there. Finally, now we've talked a little bit about the buying cycle. We talked a little bit about the content and why it's so important. But let's get into how do we turn some of these insights into strategy. And so what we'll be looking into is, what are 3 main ways in which you can build trust with your audience and start building that authentic relationship with your audience and connection. Because trust takes a long time to build and really easy to lose. So first and foremost, you want to deliver a content experience consistently on your audience terms. What this means is, people, by creating content, you're setting a certain expectation. And so you don't want to overly commit yourself to creating more content than you can, but you need to provide a consistent experience because you're setting an expectation with your audience that you're going to do certain things at certain times, and you're going to be helpful. And in terms of on audience terms, you're looking to create content that not only solves their pain points. I think everyone knows that. I think it's also different formats. A lot of people are turning to podcasts for education as well as webinars. And so there's a lot of opportunity for you to be able to reach that audience through delivering a consistent experience. Be transparent and open through your story selling and expert access. Make yourself accessible and talk about what you're doing and how does that work. And we'll go into more detail on why. And then finally, like I said, create value-forward content that helps your audience. This should be the first and foremost thing that you're trying to do. Yes, everyone will need to eventually look at features. We'll need to understand how the product works. But some people might not be aware that you even have a problem or things could be better. There's a gap there that you need to address. And by helping and supporting, you can help solve some small pain points while also softly selling your product, but by being that helpful. So let's look at a little bit of data and see from some of them from BrightTALK's own data and see how does this map and how do you do all of this stuff. So looking at some of our BrightTALK data from our 2020 BrightTALK benchmark report, we found that most of our audiences are viewing at least monthly, if not weekly or daily. That's a huge opportunity for you to reach your audience because they're going out and researching already. Now, there obviously are constraints on how much content you can create. That's okay. There are ways in which we'll talk about later in the series, there are ways in which you can create content that scales in an easy way and create, from one piece of content, 10 to 20 pieces across formats. And so, what we'll talk about later is strategies around to do that. But, what we have found is that audiences on BrightTALK in particular, but professional audiences are looking for weekly or biweekly content series. It's why podcasts are so effective. They are predictable. They typically are released same time, same day, same time, same day. And it's typically, on a specific cadence. It could be weekly, it could be every other week, it could be monthly. Once you set an expectation, you should stick with it. So it's really important to think about what is your capabilities and how do you make sure that you are creating that consistent digital experience. But not all content needs to be audio and slides. Best practices, this is where the content about the value forward content comes in. Best practices, tips and tricks are consistently the number one thing our audiences are looking for. That's not surprising. They need help. They want to know what they don't know. And you need to help them reach that and educate them. It's a huge opportunity. They also want to know what's happening in their industry. There's a lot of news happening nowadays and just in general. And so if you have a specific opinion or perspective on a reaction to news, it might not be the most evergreen content, but it will definitely be timely, and that timely content definitely attracts your audience. But the other part, I think, just it goes back to the accessibility. One-on-one expert interviews, panel discussions. These are all types of top content that is your experts being accessible. And so it's really important that you are, ensuring that you're giving value and looking at making that consistent behavior in terms of not only the specific cadence, but also the formats and the type of content. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be testing different formats for your audience, but it means that once you find something that works, that you should double down and be consistent with it. Part of this, the other part of this is, you need not only giving regular data, but also giving insightful stories that are data focused. Today I'm going over a lot of our benchmark data. And so it's important for us to be able to not only tell that story, but story sell. So, using storytelling as a way to sell your product without it being so obvious and in your face. I think some of the most clear feedback that we've gotten from our user survey, you should check it out in our benchmark report. I believe it should be attached to this presentation. The first thing they want you to do is curb the sales messages. Surprise, surprise, your buyers know that you're trying to sell to them. You don't need to make it so obvious. Some of that means not making it so heavily marketing speak in your title and abstract, but the other part means just you need to be giving that value first, and you're selling yourself through by giving that value. But the other part is using more data and research. This is the originality aspect. Use more insights for thought leaders and analysts. People want to know what they should be caring about and what's coming up ahead. So not only what pain points do they have now, but how do they optimize and improve down the road? But finally, people, these one-off webinars don't really work. We've been finding that packaging content together into themes and series works really, really nicely because it's an expected and predictable format. And what you've done is set expectation in your audience's mind of what they should be expecting and what you're going to be giving them. I find that a lot of this digital experience, digital interaction really depends on you setting the expectation, you giving a lot of value while, and following through. Because part of trust is not only are you going to be, helpful, but it's also doing consistently and being there when they need it, and ensuring that you are able to do that. And so, avoid sales pitches, obviously, but you want to make sure you switch from sales and why your product is so great to why the functionality of your product helps your buyer. It's a slight shift, but you can still softly sell your product by just talking about why they need it so much, and then how it works eventually. Professionals also just want key, relevant to their role and advance their knowledge. So that's where the insights come from. But you need to make sure that it's topical, relevant, and it can be timely. Different types of content will do different things. I find that more news analysis content will more drive in new audiences and new buyers than really convert. That's fine. An easy reactionary piece to some news that broke, I think, is a great way to get your name out there and newsjack a bit through PR, but also provide another piece of content that can be easy to create and is interesting to your audience. But really, so when you're creating your content, though, you need this authentic connection really, really starts with how you present your content to them. No one, especially with streaming live content, no one's going to know what you're going to be covering except for the title and the abstract. It's not a blog; they can't read it all the way through. And so I find that when you are finding people to register for your events, not surprising, the webinar title, the first thing that people see, similar to newspaper headlines, it's what attracts them, as well as it's the first thing they're reading. But I actually think the second part is the most interesting. The webinar abstract is likely what convinces people to register for your content. And so, within your webinar abstract, you need to make sure that you are explaining very clearly what they're going to be learning, as well as why they need to learn, and what are some conflicts and resolutions within your abstract, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But not surprisingly, the source of content, who you are, matters. People only want to learn from authority. So, while sometimes marketers have great domain knowledge, that title tends to conflict with people's expectation of who has the domain knowledge sometimes. So you need to be aware of not only is it your brand, but who your presenter is, and that feeds into people's first impression of you. And so I want to leave you with a few tips on how do you take, especially webinar content, and how do you feel. And I feel like this can be applied very heavily to blogs, to different white papers and whatnot. But to give you some tips on how do you make your content value forward and very clear to your audience. because I find that a lot of times of course you're trying to attract audiences and you're trying to get them to register or view your content. And so oftentimes I find that a lot of times we're trying to be overly clever, but we miss the mark in terms of the clarity of what people will learn. No one's going to want to waste their time if they don't understand what your content's about. And so with titles, for example, I actually find if you can be clear, concise, and clever, great. But if you can't be clever in addition to clear and concise, then you should avoid being clever, because people want to know what they will be learning and tuning into, and what they're going to get out of the presentation. And the title gives you that first opportunity. On the left side, you'll see telling stories that spread. I actually don't think that's the best title. I don't think I understand it's going to be about storytelling. I get it's going to be getting your name out there, but it doesn't really give me much on the title slide. But again, don't sacrifice clarity for cleverness. Authenticity matters. And use lists and questions to provide structure and set your audience expectations. This is why listicles and things like that work really nicely, because you're setting a certain expectation. The abstract, you need to make sure you create some conflict or juxtaposition of your ideas. Why should they be learning from you? What is this topic about? Why should they care? And what is this challenging what they're currently doing? So I find that oftentimes you can either create conflict that is either success-oriented or pain-oriented. So avoiding pain or being successful. And so you want it in your abstract, not only be clear on what people are going to be learning and with key takeaways, you also want to create this type of conflict, because these are the conflicts that people are facing right now, and this is the pain points they're trying to solve. But finally, something that I feel like people probably tend to over-rely on is using FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I find that to be the less motivating way to get people to view your content. Fear isn't a good way to drive people to buy your product. I think it's people want to know how to be successful and not necessarily how to avoid pain. That's not always the case. I think there's a lot of security vendors, for example, that need to avoid the pain of a breach, for example. So, it really depends on your industry, but I do think that oftentimes the FUD it can be too heavy. Presenter, if you can get highlight notable presenter that your audience will trust, I think that's always great. That's not always the case. I recognize that internal resources are rare and not easily accessible at times. But people want to learn from people with the domain expertise. And then finally, the cover image. You want to use an engaging, eye-catching cover image because it converts better. People want to learn from different humans, and they want to learn that what you're talking about matters to people. And not surprisingly, excuse me, 1 second. Just having small technical difficulties, but not surprisingly, the cover image needs to be authentic. It needs to be relevant to what you're covering. It also needs to ensure that it's human and you're creating that connection, because just images matter. And the title slide, the title is on the slide. I would also say that I would remove dates from any imagery that you have on your presentations in particular. It dates your content. Even if your content's evergreen, people don't like seeing a presentation that is upcoming, but actually has a date from last year. Even if the content's relevant, I tend to remove all dates from all presentations unless it's in a conference, more of a conference, in-person conference situation. But that's all of our content for today. We're going to be covering a lot more in depth later in the series, looking at how to be more tactical on how to create content, how to ensure that you are selecting the right formats, the right top content types, the right editorial, to ensure that your content not only resonating, but it's also converting your audiences in a way that helps them self-guide and it reaches them when they need it. And so with that, I'm going to look at questions. 1 second. as I ensure I don't lose my computer. And so looking at questions, so the first question I saw was, 1 second. There we go, fully charged. First question is, what's the greatest challenge to delivering content on the audience terms? If it's technology, what specifically are some of the causes? This is a good question. I actually think, so in terms of creating content, I actually think it's not the technology. I think a lot of technology nowadays has progressed where there's a lot of feature parity. So I actually don't think the technology matters as much. I actually think it's your capability of creating content. It's hard, it's not difficult to create a blog post or create content, but it's hard to do it consistently that gives value and across many formats. And so it's really important that when you're thinking about the type of content you want to create, you're thinking about what does your audience care about, the formats that they care about, the topics, and all of that. But making sure that you have the capacity to do it and do it consistently. I find that tends to be the biggest issue. That you'll find that we see certain clients who create content, inconsistently, and they tend to have more struggles getting leads and creating demand. If buyers are self-guiding themselves with the buying process, which form of content should companies focus on making stronger first? That's a great question. I don't have a great answer. It's going to be depends. I think what I've found through a lot of research is that your website, not surprise, is one of the biggest things that people will go to. And so it really depends on your industry. I find that certain industries use webinars consistently and do it in a way that that is really effective as well as sophisticated. I find that certain industries tend to do very basic presentations because that industry just hasn't gotten to the point where they're producing content. I think B2B technology and technology industry in general is probably one of the more advanced marketing industries in the world, likely. I think that some of the older industries, I think of finance, I think of healthcare, I think of the more regulated industries, it's a lot harder. And so I think it's two things there. It's that ability it's the ability to create that content consistently, but also to make sure it's resonating and that your audiences actually will care about that format itself. Another question here is, have you noticed that trust in certain resources has grown now that we have gone all virtual? If so, which resources are companies, buyers more inclined to reach for in order to make a buying choice? That's a good question. It's not surprisingly, BrightTALK has seen about 3 times the number of users using webinars once COVID started than before. We have seen both clients and companies going more to virtual events, testing out virtual events in ways that they never expected, as well as just creating more webinars. I think we're actually going to be doing a webinar on a recent survey that we did with the marketers that goes over the impact of COVID. I believe it's going to be October 8th in this BrightTALK channel. So I highly recommend that you go and register for that upcoming. But because we'll go into significantly more detail, I'll be working on that presentation and presenting it with, I believe, our CMO. But there is a lot. I think there's expectation that you should be going digital, and I think that expectation is going to last all the way through COVID. And so, I do think that we're not going to see the digital experience go away ever. I think that even when in-person conferences come back, there's going to be a virtual component because now we've set that expectation, and that's what people are going to expect. Because why should I go travel across the world to to go and learn something from experts when I can do it from the comfort of my home? There is value in-person conferences, the networking, and a lot of business is done at these conferences outside of the sessions. But in terms of learning, I think there's been a dynamic shift. What's your best advice on transitioning to the sale if the buyer no longer wants to hear the pitch? This is a tough one. If the buyer no longer hears the pitch, you've started to lose that buyer. I would say, it really depends on how have you gotten to that place. I would say that likely, oftentimes, and I think from my experience as well as our own sales team and what we see at BrightTALK, when we don't get as much traction with a lead, it tends to be because we have oversold and we haven't given value first. I get probably 100, and probably every month I get about at least 100, 200 different SDRs reaching out to me. The only ones I really talk to or even evaluate their links are the ones that are looking to understand what I care about, have shown some interest in me, and then have given value or kind of understand what most of my pain points could be. Telling me that you can increase my ROI by 600% when you don't know my business model, it doesn't make sense. What do you think of 3D virtual tour content and the value it adds? Yeah, I have a mixed opinion about this, actually. I can understand the emulating of an in-person conference and trying to create that experience. I just don't know if that's necessary. It's actually a good thing that I might go in and research and look into. When people are looking at virtual events, do they want to have an avatar? Do they want to be able to do they want the same kind of conference experience, or are they looking for something different? My suspicions are that they're likely probably looking for something different because they can. It's all digital. So when I think about virtual events, I actually think about, me being able to self-select my agenda, viewing all the content I want to view, not necessarily attending all the sessions, but the ones that are the most relevant, and creating that agenda and really learning. And that way, then that's really kind of the main reason I would go to a virtual event. I'm not sure if I see the value in 3D avatars. How can authenticity and trustworthiness be expressed within shorter content formats, like an Instagram post, for example? That's a good question. So I would say it's actually something that I'm actually I'm pushing my social media team to do more of, but it's the giving value, right? So for example, an example that I'm pushing my social media team to do is that we have a lot of survey data on our site through polls and whatnot. That's a great asset for social, because what it's doing is original research. It is a perspective, and it allows us to tell a story with data that backs it up with a supporting argument, being the data. And so I find a lot of data focused, or it's just stories. Instagram is very visual. So because of that, what we've been doing to kind of humanize our brand, as well as just to be a little more authentic, we've been doing, check out our Instagram account, but we've been doing stories of us going to in-person events, talking to marketers, doing kind of in-person interviews, doing just case studies, but telling that story in a very, very quick time. I would say that probably of anything that you do, it's just the consistency in giving that value. Let's see. So where do you see BI, AI reporting, content analytics, sentiment analysis, and pattern analysis fit into your approach? Great question. It will be in our next session, one of our next sessions. We'll be start looking at what are some of the content analytics that help feed into why you should be creating content and which types of content formats. So we'll be actually looking a little more into benchmark data and how does that play a role. And so, but if you want some more advice right now, I would recommend that you go check out the BrightTALK Blueprint. It does have a section on performance, how to measure your content performance, the way that BrightTALK has done it. What's the best way to introduce your service on your website? Start with benefits first, abstract. How can I fix their pain points? Yeah, I think with your homepage in particular, you have to think about how is your audience finding your homepage. So there are a few different routes, but I think probably the biggest way, besides you providing a link to your homepage, although I'm not sure if that makes the most sense in general, is they're going to be finding it through search. And so, whether that search is by looking for solutions and products, or that solution is looking for you, there's a lot of different ways to get to your website. I would be, like I said, very value forward, and I'd do a little bit of proof, case studies. But I would focus on the benefits and the value, as well as some resources, right? Because especially if someone hasn't found your website by looking up a solution, they might not know who you are. And so they're going to need to not only learn who you are, but they might want to learn from you. And so you have an opportunity to start building that trust by giving that value. How do we get people to not multitask during live sessions? Do you think the on-demand recording contribute to people not showing up or not engaging? This is probably one of the most common questions I've got this year about virtual events and even just online presentations. You can't control people. You can't force them to be interactive. You can't make them show up. You have to entice them. And so I think in terms of getting people to show up to your content, it's really tough, especially this live presentation. I can't tell right in the top of my head how many people are live right now, but I'm expecting about 30% of the 1,000 people that registered to be attending the session because of their schedules. Maybe they just didn't want to attend live, just want to view on demand. People want flexibility to view content on their terms, and that's what that means. So but you need to entice them to show up live. So why would I show up live to a presentation like this? It's because I want access to the live presenter. I have questions. It's a really interesting presenter that I would never be able to access to if I didn't join this presentation. What's that value that's going to drive people to show up to come and attend? And that tends to be a big way, but I find that trying to force live attendance is really tough. I have seen, but I do push on demand because the value, the shelf life of your live content is an hour. The shelf life of your recorded content is months, weeks, years. So it's really important that you're not trying to force that. But I do think that within your content itself, how to make sure people are paying attention. Again, you can't force it, but make it interactive. I didn't use any polls for this presentation, but I will be going in the future. But you have to remember that the behavior that people are viewing now, it's not always, not everyone can spend an hour listening to a session. They are viewing a session and paying full 100% attention. Because people's attention spans, especially nowadays, is so small. As long as they're listening, and as long as you explain and set the expectation, there's going to be visuals and there's going to be data, and you should be checking it out. I find that reinforces it, but you can't make people view your content. And that is actually all of the questions. And so first and foremost, I want to thank you today for attending today's session. I hope that you got value. My goal here, of course, is to ensure that not only are we talking about things that are new and novel and original, but I'm giving you the value that you're expecting from me. And so, but thank you for attending the first episode of the Content Intelligence series. Before you go, again, there are some additional resources in the attachments button at the bottom of your player. Please also give us feedback and ratings. I would love to be able to incorporate either certain topics that you want us to go down, or just how can we make this a little bit better. I see that some of you are giving me feedback to the questions about font sizes, whatnot. That is noted. I will be improving that for next time. So please give us ratings and feedbacks. We do appreciate it, and we do take into consideration as we're planning out our content. But finally, tune in next time as we start to break down really the content creation process. So now that we've understood how audiences buy, how does content can influence that buying behavior, we have an opportunity to start breaking down that process and really starting for the next episode looking at how do we figure out trending topics that resonate with your audience? How do you start doing research? Where do you go research? And then how do you go through in a content ideation process to come up with something that will not only resonate with our audience, but bring in for SEO and think about topic clusters and things along those lines. Later in the series, we're going to cover a wide range of topics from looking at how do you execute on content. So we'll be looking at an inside look at content operations for BrightTALK, looking at how do we plan out content, because my team actually produces, with a team of about 7, produces roughly 500 webinars a year. So we'll talk about how do we go about doing that, as well as then what data and analytics we look to measure and perform and really look and ensure that we are creating relevant timely content. But again, thank you again for joining. I hope that you learned something today, you got value, and have a great day. Thank you.